On September 4th, 1823, Gioacchino Rossini's Semiramide was first performed in Vienna with tremendous success. The production featured a star-studded cast comprising French rising prima donna Joséphine Faudoch-Menvieille, bass Luigi Lablache, and virtuoso tenor Giovanni David. None else than Carl Maria von Weber assisted to one of the performances and claimed, quote, "I cannot say much about the music other than it is by Rossini, but the performance, no doubt everything must be effective when it is sung and performed this way," end quote. Here Weber questioned the status of Rossini's operas as self-sufficient works. Without first-rate singers, they would amount to little. Even among the many German Rossini devotees, this idea circulated widely. Writing from Vienna a year after Weber, Hegel reported enthusiastically, quote, "Now I understand why Rossini's music is bad-mouthed in Germany. This is music created solely for Italian voices. It is not for the music as such, but for the singing per se that all else has been created. Rossini's music has meaning only as sung," end quote. Hegel acknowledged that many Germans were particularly critical towards such view. His insight foreshadowed a problematic yet influential opposition between Italian opera as event and German music as work, between the evanescence of singers' performances and the stability of a text generated by the creative mind of a composer. Karl Dahlhaus's famous definition of Rossini's opera as recipes for performance toyed with such an opposition, bringing to the fore the fact that these conceptual binaries had become a long-lasting trope by the time of his account of 19th century music. Their pervasiveness and ultimate crystallization into hard-to-die historiographical topoi can be understood in the context of what Andrea Huyssen has called the Great Divide between high and low culture, a discursive mode that constructed these aesthetic categories as distinct, hierarchically organized, and mutually exclusive. To be sure, Huyssen regarded the Great Divide paradigm as the byproduct of and reaction to the massification of culture, while the Viennese Rossini fever of the 1810s and 20s can hardly be described in these terms. But for Huyssen, the discourse around the Great Divide is related both historically and theoretically to two crucial intellectual phenomena already at play in early 19th century Viennese criticism. One is romantic idealism, and the second is the gradual definition of an entertainment cultural industry. More importantly, Huyssen points out that the separation between high and low cultures has overshadowed the, quote, mutual relations and discursive configurations, end quote, that originally bound these two spheres. Along similar lines, recent scholarship has challenged historiographical tendencies, reducing Rossini and Italian and French opera to the ephemeral opposite of Beethoven and German instrumental music. And here, of course, I'm thinking primarily of Nick Matthews and Benjamin Walton's collection of essays, among others. Instead, it has emphasized the porosity of the aesthetic categories that came to epitomize a porosity that, as Julian Johnson put it, disclosed, quote, modalities of the diverse and fractured response of European culture to the conditions of social modernity, end quote. Vienna was a city where the experience of Rossini's operas shaped the discourse on the present, musical and known, at a time when a growing awareness of local music history was emerging under different ideological premises. In this paper, I examined the early Viennese reception of Rossini's operas, arguing that they were placed within a hybrid cultural space that catalyzed the sense of transition and precarious balance generated by the political system of the time. Experienced as a powerful combination of fashionable and cutting-edge expressive tools, Rossini's operas cut across the divide between high and low culture, reinforcing the relationship between his music and a local experience of modernity. The Viennese debate over Rossini's operas was stirred up by two contributing factors. The first was the prospective importation of entrepreneurial models of theatrical administration from Italy, which introduced the rules of profit-driven capitalist logic in what had long been a state-controlled realm of cultural production. The second factor consisted of the political implications of the rhetoric behind Hegel's and Weber's observations. In Vienna, contesting Italian opera meant jeopardizing the ideological edifice that the Habsburgs had painstakingly erected since the Congress of Vienna of 1814-15. Due to its long local history, in Vienna Italian opera was not simply a foreign other that needed to be resisted. Its cultural legitimation was an important contributing factor to representing an imperial multinational self, especially after the Congress of Vienna had restored Habsburg authority over several states of the Italian peninsula. The urge to negotiate creation and performance, text and event, pleasure and reflection was itself part of the cultural construction of the Habsburg multinational imperial ideal. Ideas associated with German Romanticism and cultural nationalism, of course, proliferated and came to affect music criticism. They were famously promoted by the authoritative Leipzig Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, which became the model, starting with the title, of the first Viennese newspaper entirely dedicated to music, the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung mit besonderer Rücksicht auf den österreichischen Kaiserstaat, general musical journal with particular consideration on the Austrian Empire. The editor was Ignaz Franz von Mosel, secretary of Count Moritz von Dietrichstein, one of the most staunch supporter of German cultural patriotism at court. And by the way, Dietrichstein was also one of the opposer of the court's projects of having Barbaia come over and take over the Kerneto Theater, the court opera house. Other journals, however, fostered remarkably different critical orientations. The Allgemeine Theaterzeitung and Der Sammler, two leading Viennese newspapers dedicated to theatrical and operatic affairs, were founded by two playwrights, Adolf Beuerle and Ignaz Franz Castelli, both well acquainted with the practical life on stage, the workings of commercial theatrical enterprises, and the reasons of public success. They were therefore more indulgent and at times even supportive of the perceived hedonism and entertaining elements of Rossini's operas. All these positions, however, collided in the face of the tumultuous dissemination of Rossini's operas in Vienna. When the Italian impresario Antonio Cera and his company first produced Tancredi in Munich and Vienna in 1816, Rossini's music baffled local critics. The correspondent of the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, for instance, seemed disoriented. He acknowledged that Tancredi contained melodies, quote, worthy of a genius, genialisch, but also that its melodiousness, as pleasurable as it was, had something ineffable and hard to pin down, almost deprived of meaning. Quote, the music of Tancredi has no character. It is neither tragic nor comic, but something in its own right that pleases everybody, even if one plays the role of a quibbler. And yet it is to be criticized, but as one criticizes, one cannot help being touched. It pleases like a face whose beauty cannot be denied, even by an enemy, end quote. While acknowledging that Rossini's music embodied what a few years later Stendhal would have called the ideal of beauty, this reviewer also points out that the opera's perceived lack of character was a major limitation. Indeed, the characteristic as an aesthetic concept entailed cultural and political anxieties that are crucial to assess the political effects of the Rossini fever in Vienna. The notion of character, the set of defining unique and unconventional qualities of an artwork, was pivotal to the gestation of German cultural nationalism. In his essay on German architecture from 1773, Goethe proposed that characteristic art is as original as sincere as it was unique to the culture from which it originated, laying the foundation stone for the ideological construction of Germany as Kulturnation. Instrumental music became a particularly fertile testing ground for these new aesthetics, where it combined with rational principles of unity and homogeneity, the marker of human agency, in Richard Wilde's words. In this way, instrumental music became the embodiment of an original authorial voice. As literary scholar Deirdre Lynch has shown, however, morphing notions of character also implied a shift in cultural values from what he calls the principle of coherence and generalizability to that which articulates difference, end quote. The emphasis on depth, uniqueness, and originality transformed, quote, a consumer culture into a psychological culture, unquote, and paved the way to the separation between high art and entertainment culture, a separation dictated by market considerations. From this perspective, the repercussions of the reviewer's perplexity towards Tancredi's lack of character are far-reaching. It ushers in the suspicion that Rossini's opera might belong to a string of skillfully but serially produced scores aimed at the immediate satisfaction of audiences craving for novelties, and pinpoints a general distrust towards the profit-oriented opera industry controlled by private impresarios. As soon as it became clear that the so-called Rossini fever ignited by Tancredi was not going to recede anytime soon, many Viennese critics scolded Rossini's music for being repetitive, unoriginal, trite, and of course characterless. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time today to discuss in depth the nuances of these critical tropes, but let me pause briefly to the critical reactions to La Gazzaladra, which premiered in German translation at the Theater an der Wien in 1819. Thus wrote the reviewer of the Wiener Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, quote, oops, sorry, this was, here we are. The entire weight of the piece of La Gazzaladra falls on the servant maid. Here, Rossini had the opportunity to show how people sing in a village, how to let people from a lower standing sing. Yet he failed hugely. In this opera, everyone sings as in a city, at times as in a capital. The housemaid sings like a Semiramis. I noticed that in his current operas, Rossini neglects simple singing and increasingly preserves brilliant singing, unquote. According to this critic, Rossini's most unforgivable mistake is his portrayal of the female protagonist of the opera, the naive Ninetta, here turned into the leading prima donna of an opera seria. Rossini's stylistic camouflage aimed solely at pleasing an urban audience, according to this reviewer. The vocal writing for Ninetta, in other words, does not provide characteristic music. Rossini can dazzle his spectators only by depriving Ninetta of her authentic voice, and the opera of its allegedly characteristic folkstone. But for others, such an argument looked hardly tenable. The reviewer of Der Sammler, for instance, for one, claimed, quote, "The audience wants to be pleasantly entertained and amused. It wants to listen to singing, not to musical declamation. For this reason, Rossini has become our darling, and he will remain so as long as melody, the soul of music, claims its primary rights, that is, as long as the word will exist," end quote. This position seems to merge all critical views, namely Italian opera as a locus classicus of melodious singing, with a new composer-focused frame. What this critic provided was a remarkably modern view of opera as a multifaceted phenomenon whose existence requires the inspiration of an ingenious composer, the interpretation of an insightful singer, and the disposition of the listener to take pleasure into both the composer's music and its performance. To several Viennese intellectuals, furthermore, Rossini's music was not mere compliance with the taste of the audience, nor pace Weber with the demands of performers. In his planned yet never completed essay on the composer, the leading Austrian dramatist Franz Grillparzer intended to argue, quote, how absurd it would be to reduce operatic music to a slave of poetry, and to demand that, by negating its peculiar effectiveness, the former be restricted to mimicking imperfectly with her sounds what poetry clearly conveys with her concepts, end quote. For Grillparzer, Rossini's melodies represented first and foremost a celebration of music's most genuine contribution to opera, one that Teutonic music declamation was suppressing. Rossini's arrival in Vienna in 1822 reinforced his image as a composer inspired by strong authorial intentions, even under the pressure of specific performing contexts. His first task in the city was to supervise a production in German of La Cenerentola at the Kärntner Theater. Friedrich August Kanne, the editor of the Viennese Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, provided a fascinating account of the rehearsing process, explaining what he considered the essence of Rossini's music as a combination and fundamental inseparability between his authorial voice and his physical voice. I apologize for the long quotation, which I hope you can all read, but it's fairly interesting. Anybody charmed by the melodic shapes that Rossini's pen brought out in the mystic sign of notation, and who also was fortunate to hear the composer himself sing and perform his melodies, has almost found the key to the solution of an enigma that perhaps some are often grappling with secretly, and indeed some may even have been concerned about. Rossini's musical forms imprint themselves spontaneously on the mind and invite us to sing along. This allure is essential, precisely because in the art of music we possess works of genius which play on our admiration by means of their inner perfection, but once we listen to them, neither leave an impression of their essential form, nor have the power to awake the irresistible desire to sing what we heard. This particular attractiveness of a musical piece by Rossini to sing it after hearing it is undeniably the consequence of a condition that we find unified with the spiritual essence of this composer, and whose cause must be sought partly in the physical strength and partly in the previous perfect cultivation of his vocal organ. Rossini's voice is as beautiful as his songs and has a degree of flexibility that is equal to what he demands from his singers." End quote. Here Canne opens up the possibility of a set of aesthetic values in which authorial intentions acquire full meaning in performance for the listener who is incited to sing along. This is very different than claiming that Rossini's music merely exalts the skills of his performers. It almost reverses the claim. Canne seems to imply that the music no longer accommodates the singer's vocal features. Rather, it is the singer's task to reveal the authentic shape of the music in performance, a context in which the audience is involved thanks to the essence of the music performed. The shape of the music is already subsumed in what the composer wrote and results from the composer's own knowledge of the challenges of performance. Rossini's own physical voice, his flawless training as a singer, his intimate knowledge of the mechanics of vocal production informs his authorial voice. His arrival in Vienna also showed that the frequent accusation of his lack of technical skills was misleading. His operatic music was instead grounded in a different kind of knowledge, which involved a profound understanding of the special relationship between his music as written and as performed, and of vocal technique. So, at a time when German aesthetic values were gradually disseminating among Viennese critics, but still had to consolidate, Rossini's operas emerged as bridging between the head and the heart, reason and senses, poiesis and praxis. Such fluidity, of course, was not unique to Vienna, but the Viennese context of these years, with its coexistence of different artistic creeds, aesthetic approaches, and political agendas, reframed these divisions in a way that favored the recognition of a conciliatory common ground between the pressures of local supporters of German culture and the multinational ambitions of the Habsburg Empire. Setting such common ground was a political goal for which the Habsburg court strove in several domains: cultural, administrative, social, and economic. Because the modernity of Rossini's music lived on a similar threshold, the aesthetic terms of its reception in Vienna intersected with and helped redirect some of the political tensions of the time. Rossini's music, its perceived combination of genius and triviality, artfulness and popularity, tragic and comic, high and low, Italian and German, especially with Zelmira, was therefore a cultural phenomenon that shaped and drove contemporaries' experience of modernity, one characterized by ambiguities, contradictions, and compromises. Rossini's operas not only blurred the boundaries between low and high culture, effective entertainment versus exceptional artworks. They also contributed to the discourse against those aspects of modernity that many observers reputed unsettling, threatening, and dehumanizing. They occupied something akin to that gray area that, according to 20th century observers, separates modernity as a condition and modernism as a critical reflection upon it. What Marshall Bergman has called the, quote, making oneself somewhat at home in the maelstrom of perpetual disintegration and renewal, trouble and anguish, ambiguity and contradiction that characterizes the experience of modernity. Building on Huyssen's critique of the Great Divide, film scholar Miriam Hansen has argued that, quote, modernism encompasses a whole range of cultural and artistic practices that register, respond to, and reflect upon processes of modernization and the experience of modernity, including a paradigmatic transformation of the conditions under which art is produced, transmitted, and consumed. End quote. She has called this kind of modernism vernacular because, quote, it combines the dimension of the quotidian, of everyday usage, with connotations of discourse, idiom, and dialect, with circulation, promiscuity, and translatability, end quote. I am not claiming, of course, that the historical and cultural conditions from which the early Viennese discourse around Rossini stemmed can be compared to those affecting more recent development of modernism, vernacular and non. Yet, I would argue that Hansen's idea of vernacular modernism can be usefully adapted to my case study, at least for two reasons. First, Rossini's operas were a multidirectional cultural phenomenon that cut across aesthetic hierarchies, both appropriated by social elites and, as we heard yesterday from Emanuele Senici, also rubbing shoulder with what later would be called the popular sphere. Second, the fluid aesthetic status of Rossini's operas was inseparable from changes in the modes of production, from court patronage to entrepreneurial models, changes that complicated traditional divides between edification and entertainment and impinged upon processes of identity formation. While Romantic idealism had begun to mark an incipient division conditioning the critical discourse on opera, between the mid-1810s and the mid-1820s, the terms of the debates were still open enough to allow Rossini's operas to fluctuate between the opposing poles of the highbrow and the vernacular. Only later in the century did the distinction between high and low work of art and commodity resulted in a pronounced push for modernist idioms on the one hand, and in the commodification of artistic production in popular genres on the other. Rossini's vernacular modernism, in sum, was representative of a situation of transition, one in which cultural phenomena and ideas spun into a variety of critical threads that at times knot together precariously. When changing historical, ideological, and political conditions came to cut these knots, Rossini gradually became the jolly, ephemeral, and therefore dark side of Germany's shining moon. If Carl Maria von Weber did not understand fully what Rossini meant for the Viennese of his age, he did nonetheless foretell what he came to mean for later generations. Thank you.